Rachel Armstrong from the University of Newcastle. And then after that, we're going to have a discussion between our speakers in the afternoon, led by Theodore Spiropoulos.
Thank you, Kostas, for this invitation to this very interesting workshop. Unlike most of you, I come to this meeting not because I'm an expert on compound multi-materialities and 3D manufacture. I admit I have never used a 3D printer, and I have only a very basic understanding of parametric design, so I don't have a PowerPoint here. I come to this meeting, and I wrote the essay that Kostas asked me, and which I'm going to use for my presentation, mainly as a student of fabrication and what I call process of material engagement. Those two processes, fabrication and material engagement, I place at the very center of human becoming. And it is from the perspective of human becoming that I will approach the topic of multi-materiality. Now, notice I speak of human becoming and not of becoming human. In my field of research, which goes by the name of cognitive archaeology, this is a difference that makes a difference. Becoming human implies that humanity is a fixed and universal evolutionary stage. It refers to the process of human origins, that is, to the process of speciation by which we came to be the kind of species we are, sometime between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. On that view, humanity is a biological given upon which we build layers and varieties of culture. Now, human becoming means something different. It refers to an open and largely ongoing process. Humanity is not a genetic setup or an evolutionary stage, but an accomplishment, a dynamic co-evolutionary entanglement of people, materials, and things. We have a mind which is also inextricably intertwined with the plastic culture. I call that metaplasticity. Culture, in this case, is not a separate, added layer of complexity, or an external skin, or an envelope, but a compound of material forces that mingle and assemble, allowing us to become what we are. The reason I emphasize this distinction, the distinction between becoming human and human becoming, is because it has important implications for understanding the anthropological dimensions of what we discuss today. For the advocates of the former view, namely becoming human, any change or reconfiguration of materiality, like the one promised, at least, by multi-materiality and 3D printing, remains largely an external and basically a secondary issue. It doesn't really matter. Compound materialities might influence human life and thinking, but they do it from a safe distance. They provide input for your cultural program, but they are not going to change it. They are simply new tools for making stuff. But whatever those stuff might be, or whatever forms they might possibly take in the near or distant future, they are not the stuff of life. They may appear lifelike, but they are not alive. Now, if now you are an advocate of the latter view, namely human becoming, things are rather different. On this construal, any messing around with the forms, flows, and forces of matter equals messing up with the forms and forces of life. the underlying assumption here is that instead of simply counting on biology for reproducing ourselves, we rather extend ourselves and we construct new cognitive and material ecologies for growing ourselves and our minds and instituting ourselves and our minds. We create things which in turn create us. Now, I don't know where you stand relevant to those issues or if you have ever thought about them. What I do know, based on what I have read about the topic of the workshop and from what I heard from the presentations today, is that you are definitely messing around with the forms, flows, and forces of matter. So as a strong advocate of human becoming, of the metaplastic view of materiality I just described, I do hope you know what you're doing when you wish you could print a new world. I don't mean that in a negative way. As an archaeologist, I also know that when the first compound adhesives were made in Southern Africa around 70,000 years ago, they did not simply provide an effective technique for attaching sharp stone segments to hafts, creating novel weapons and tools. More importantly, they provided a new ecology of mind. Compound adhesive manufacture demands multitasking and the use of abstraction. The compound glues used to fix the segments to shafts are made from disparate ingredients using an irreversible process. They require people to do and think several things at the same time, and thus they may have stimulated advanced working memory capacity and recursive mental abilities, maybe for the first time in human evolution. I use this example to illustrate my contention about the priority of material engagement. We came to have a sapient mind because we are Homo faber. So like most of you, I'm fascinated by the future promises and socio-technical imaginaries surrounding those new digital technologies that we've been talking today. I'm curious to find out what they afford as tools for design, or about how they can change our sense of place and our modes of being, of dwelling and of making. Ubiquitous computing and the materialization of digital information are here to stay. Maybe as someone who probably knows less than any other person in this room about the technical details and applications of what we discussed today, I'm challenged and still struggling to understand what is really new or possible about those new fabrication technologies. Is it what they allow us to design that is changing, or is it something about design itself that is changing? How multi-material digital design and 3D printing affects the designer's understanding of materiality, time, and space, what kind of problems it creates, and what possible solution it promotes. I admit that I find the promise of a printable world dissonant. What kind of humanities or materialities a 3D printable world affords? What it means to have a 3D printer at your desktop. What happens with non-printable stuff and material? I suspect that what is printable may not always be important, and what is important may not be printable. I'm also becoming increasingly skeptical about the way nowadays innovation is being imposed on people not as a source of creativity, but as an obligation or as a ready-made product for mass production and consumption. I also feel we are still lacking a good understanding about the basics. And this is where the imminent 3D printing revolution can become maybe a threat. What do we mean by the concept of multimateriality. The very question implies that we have a well-defined notion of materiality, which we clearly don't. So what are we after here? If multimateriality is introduced to signify something new, we need to explain what exactly that is. If, on the other hand, the term is not aiming to articulate something new, but mainly to disturb, reconfigure, or maybe reinvent old conventions of design, we need to describe how exactly that happens and for what reason. If multi-material 3D printing is to change the way we experience materiality and the process of fabrication, we should better start thinking about those questions before committing ourselves to this new socio-technical or aesthetic imaginary and to the new dependencies that it will create. So what about the recent proliferation of new, so-called new materialism and the so-called object-oriented ontologies? Our growing excitement and anxiety about notions of vital materiality and material agency is symptomatic of a peculiar psychopathology of the modern capitalist ethos of fabrication. This psychopathology is the product of the oppressive separatist logic of modernism that has alienated humans from the spirit of matter and the enactive force of life and creative evolution. We want to reclaim that spirit and the bodily intelligence that comes with it, and a sense that multimateriality can be a useful tool to that end, opening up new ways of discovering hidden dimensions of material existence. Much more, to be sure, needs to be said about the precise ways in which this blurring or fusion of material boundaries happens, and about the possible socio-political and economic implications. There is a pressing need to understand better the new politics and habits of design to which such mediation are giving birth. The critical eye of ethnography and digital anthropology will have to be effectively employed if we are to make sense of the depth and diversity of this phenomenon. But for my purpose here, I'm interested in something more basic. It is the large picture of fabrication and materiality that I want to bring into focus. Whatever exactly it is that the multimateriality promises about the future of design, it is essentially an instance of fabrication. And like any other instance of fabrication, from the origins of compound adhesives I mentioned around 70,000 years ago, to the creation of machinery in the 19th century, to the digital industry of the 20th century, and to the plastic architecture of the 21st century, essentially it provides an experiment in process philosophy and thus an opportunity to rethink the old question of matter and form. This brings us to the problem of hylomorphism. The term comes from Aristotle's philosophy and ontology, and is a blend of two words, matter, ili, in Greek, and form, morphe, in Greek. So a common fallacy when we think about design, tectonic or other, has been to assume that form, organic or artificial, pre-exists the process that gives rise to it. That is, to think of the process of making as the transcription of a pre-existent form, realized in some abstract domain, and can be genetic, mental, or an algorithm, to the material domain of the physical world. I want to argue against this hylomorphic view of tectonics and the internalist, computational view of creativity that it implies. The anthropologist Tim Ingle has been also criticizing this hylomorphic tradition of thinking about design and, by extension, architecture. His discussion of the example of a brick, adopted from the philosopher Gilbert Simonand, can help us to illustrate his critique of design as the imposition of preconceived abstract form on inert matter. Imagine the image of a brick, of making a brick. It seems all you need is a lump of soft clay and a mold, usually of a rectangular shape. The clay is plastic and formless. The mold is rigid and preformed. Pressing the clay into the mold, we impose form on matter. But is this really how we make bricks out of clay? Probably not. For one thing, the clay and the mold, matter and form, needs to be constructed. The clay needs dug out from the soil. It has to be sieved and kneaded before it is ready for use. The mold needs to be carpentered from hardwood or some other material. This process I've tried to reveal before brings us at the very heart of the problem of hylomorphism. The matter of one thing is the form for another. You cannot separate matter and form or prioritize the one over the other. They can only exist as part of a specific process of growth or of making. How can we avoid that problem? I propose a hylonoetic view of creativity. Now, I use the term Healy for matter and the term Noesis for mind, thinking, nous. According to that view, design is no longer a process by which the mind imposes form on matter. Instead, it is a process of an active discovery and material engagement. Mind and matter are one, and thus the process of building and forming are as much mental as they are physical. Now, all that works fine when we discuss about bricks, clay, or other forms of craftsmanship, but what is their meaning in the case of multi-materials and 3D fabrication? In other words, what is the meaning of craft in the world of digital media? We find those questions difficult, I think, because, as I said, we don't have a good understanding about how computational form generation processes can be source of materiality, maybe of a new materiality. There seems to be an unbridgeable experiential gap between our sense of the digital and our sense of the material. It is here that I suggest new technologies like 3D printing, by blurring the boundary between digitality and materiality, can help us to understand the processes involved in the constitution of form and to re-examine the experience of built space as a path of human becoming, as a process. However, although I do recognize the fusing possibilities that 3D fabrication opens up for discovering the material qualities of the digital, I'm also worried that it remains dangerously detached from the bodily intelligence and the details of human action. This brings us to the issue of technique, embodiment, and skill. What are the implications of fused materials and 3D printing for those notions? For me, architecture, like many other modes of making and thinking, is above all a prosthetic gesture. I imagine that for the designer and the architect, the passage from coding to multi-materiality by means of 3D printing signals a whole new cognitive ecology of enhancing design outcomes. Nonetheless, the increased flexibility of parametric design demand obedience to the rules, constraints, and relations of the algorithmic input that will subsequently result in a multi-material output. I suggest that multi-material fabrication have very little to offer beyond accessible mass production, maybe, if it remains subordinate to an algorithmic logic or habit of making that treats matter not as an active process, but as a mere substrate or a passive receptacle of form. In itself, no fusion of material suffices to produce vital architecture or a better city. Instead, with multi-materiality comes an obligation to foster experimentation with new modes of matter, of life, and of thinking, aiming to resist the hylomorphic imposition of form on matter, and instead to promote the creation of a genuinely morphogenetic materiality that moves beyond mere simulation. This is no easy task. What is needed, I think, is a process ontology that will allow us to move from hylomorphism to hylonoetics, or to technonoetics, Alexandros. That can be another term. A simple rule of thumb, I suggest, that the value and potential contribution of multimateriality can be judged against let me express it a different way. As a simple rule of thumb that we could use to evaluate multimateriality as a basic principle is something I borrow from the work of Richard Sennett. Work with resistance in borderline conditions. Let me explain. Resistances, according to Sennett, can be found or made, but they both require toleration and imagination. Sennett also speaks of sides of resistance, and he differentiates between borders and boundaries. Boundaries, he writes, using an example from natural ecology, are like cell walls. Borders, in contrast, resemble the cell membrane. A boundary is simply an edge where things end, an envelope, if you wish. A border, by contrast, is a site of exchange and interaction. It's full of energy. Sennett argues that these natural distinctions are reflected in the built human environment, and he suggests that so far as architecture, urbanism, and the built environment is concerned, working with resistance essentially means converting boundaries into borders. The problem is, and that's the basic principle I mentioned before, that we are better at building boundaries than borders. One important challenge then concerns the way we mark the difference between abstract space and meaningful place. Humans, like many other animals, build to shelter and protect. But unlike other animals, they also build to define the ontological conditions and limits of selfhood. In many ways, then, the boundaries of the forms we build become the limits of our consciousness. And if we also accept that a being's mental states can never extend beyond those boundaries, then setting the right kind of boundaries is essential for what or who we are and for how we interact with each other. In short, material and buildings are alive because through them we grow our minds and extend ourselves. There is nothing new about that. Buildings and materials have always been alive since the rock shelters of the Paleolithic or the Neolithic longhouses and earthwork enclosures. What is changing, maybe, is our ability to transform boundaries into borders. If a new materiality, fused or other, multi-material or not, can be shown to accommodate this transformation, then I suggest it has the potential to become a freeing device and thus a force of creative evolution. If, on the contrary, a new materiality does not afford for this kind of transformation, then I suspect it can and eventually will be turned either into a force of oppression or a medium of subordination. I mean that more in an aesthetic sense rather than an overtly political one, although it becomes increasingly hard to disentangle the two. Thank you very much.
Should I just close? Oh, goody. So I want to follow on from that excellent presentation, maybe making a few propositions about how we might turn boundaries into borders. So at the start of the new millennium, we appear to have reached a tipping point in the Anthropocene, where we've never been so prosperous or numerous as a species. Yet we're also in the process of reverse terraforming our planet. We've created a gaping sixth great extinction over the last 10,000 years of human activity, where we've reduced the liveliness of the planet by causing the disappearance of many species, like the Ice Age megafauna. Above us and beyond us looms the prospect of a fourth wave of human expansion, which could take us to life beyond our home planet. A new wave of Apollo 8 orphan entrepreneurs is investing personal fortunes in space ventures. Planetary Resources is planning to harvest asteroids for mineral resources, and Elon Musk aims to establish a colony and even die on the red planet. Yet we're almost as blind to our cosmic prospects and opportunities as John Milton when he wrote Paradise Lost, since the visible fabric that we inhabit constitutes only 5% of reality, the rest of it being 68% dark energy and 27% dark matter. Caught in the middle of two existential voids, extinction or escape, perhaps like Milton, we may still find cause to remain optimistic about our human potential, and despite the chaos of adversity, find new bounty here on Earth through allegiance with a complex material realm that constitutes a new kind of nature. Our current anxiety is provoked by a rapidly changing sense of being in the world, whereby for the first time in a couple of millennia, Western civilization has started to understand reality through a different lens. Rather than being made up as a series of hierarchically ordered, discrete objects which characterizes an industrial age worldview, we now view life as being complex, networked, and in a state of permanent flux. This perspective may be thought of as an ecological era, which has been shaped by a range of overlapping developments in many disciplines, including philosophy, science, technology, and cultural theory, particularly over the last century. However, our participation in this cultural paradigm shift is entirely independent of its symptoms, such as whether we believe in climate change, practice good green citizenship, or recycle our waste. Nor is the ecological era merely an academic attitude. It has become an everyday reality with the advent of the internet, which has sprung us from previous limits imposed by geography, identity, culture, and materiality. Now we can simultaneously and coherently explore new ways of being and living through interconnection, complexity, and process. However, industrial age views, materials, and tools are designed to simplify a messy world and still largely surround us. Yet, the ecological era does not invite us simply to substitute one hegemony for another, where, for example, choosing a process-based reality is better than dwelling in object-centered perspectives. Rather, it presents us with a stack of overlapping and competing ideas that are available for dealing with the colossal changes in which we're immersed. One of the realities that is challenging for architecture in the emerging ecological era is our increasing understanding that matter is not brute and obedient, but may be lively and agentized. Indeed, the environmental conditions which shape the expectations of 21st century design practices face the significant challenges of unruly material flows such as rising sea levels, plastics, forged in our washing machine oceans as sands, and alien metabolisms of garbage tips that leak toxic metals and gases into the environment. Consequently, architects are using the paradoxical qualities of the material realm to engage the contradictory processes of creativity and destruction in many acts of new synthesis. Developing conceptual and technical platforms that deal with complexification and multiple materials enables designers to establish appropriate programs and tactics that find synergy with organic complexity. The Gothic style, Art Nouveau, and biomimicry have established attitudes that look to embody an organic design strategy, transposing selected design elements into forms and fabrics that manipulate inert substrates such as stone and more recently plastics. Yet even with the most advanced manufacturing platforms, such as multi-material 3D printing systems, the form-finding approaches alone do not enable designers to make an origins of life transition working with environmentally inert or toxic materials to directly manipulating biological substrates that underpin life. Nor do they encapsulate the nurturing exchanges of molecules that underpin our environmental metabolic networks, which enable life to thrive. Paul Klee developed a pedagogical approach that outlined how artistic elements like the line, dimension, the curve, and energy, which is kinetic and chromatic, could resist the tradition of static formalisms through emergence. By combining these fundamental qualia, a state of lifelike becoming could potentially be attained through design. By coupling this kind of design thinking with the innate properties of our recently enlivened material realm, creates new opportunities in the synthesis of complex multi-materials for developing more qualitatively enriching design tactics and spatial programs. We're starting to develop manufacturing systems that even begin to decenter human agency in the production of space by engaging multiple, highly distributed acts of design. In the last 30 years or so, developments in biotechnology have enabled us to work directly with living processes as a technical platform and combine life with classical design methodologies. So fashion designer Iris van Herpen relentlessly explores the synthesis of multiple materials in her couture collections, whereby here magnetic self-assembly becomes the basis for sculptural detail on clothing. And Skylar Tibbett's work, which we've seen earlier, examines the possibility of 4D printing spaces and techniques that twist geometric forms into new configurations when permeated with fluids. Henk Jonkers seeds his bioconcrete with extremophile bacteria. And Neri Oxman, whose work we've also seen earlier, uses silkworms as a computer-guided agency within the production system of her silk pavilion. It is even possible to wholly print 3D structures from cells that persist within our bodies as wholly functional systems, an approach that is being used in organ replacement. So rather than being a resource for consumption by machines, biotechnological advances over the last 30 years have enabled us to understand life's processes as an operating system that can perform useful work. Yet for these material possibilities to reach a broader sphere of relevance, a tool set is needed, both conceptual and practical, to enable designers and engineers to compute with and directly manipulate them. I'm going to call this field natural computing, although contestably it could be called unconventional computing or morphological computing or a whole various other forms of computing. But I'm going to stick with the term natural computing for now. I'm going to describe it as an emerging scientific field that's been inspired by Alan Turing's interest in the computational powers of nature. and may enable a more directly material-based technical platform to exist and become available to designers and engineers. The research field currently includes a range of interests and overlapping practices, from Andrew Adamatsky's slime mold computation of transportation networks to Ben DeLacy Costello's chemical patterning systems and Martin Hanzak and Takashi Ekigami's dynamic droplets. I'm going to let this movie play for a little bit just because I see this as being a literal and metaphoric birth of a technical platform whereby a droplet that doesn't have any central program, such as DNA, quite literally wriggles itself free from an amniotic sac of its own production. And really, for me, when I first came across this work in 2007, I was struck by the way that these very simple material systems, and of course simple being very few ingredients rather than actually technically in their performance, which is obviously highly complex, how their iterative underlying generative processes do not need to abstract information from natural systems in order to emulate lifelike processes. In fact, they manage to combine information and production system by directly dealing with the massive parallel processing potential of matter, which confers agentized substrates with incredible creativity. This includes the propensity to introduce exchange in a system and complexify rather than simplify substrates. These approaches facilitate change and leakage in architectures, which are composed of agile materialities and soft scaffoldings that act as the sites of new kinds of syntheses. Since the advent of supramolecular chemistry in the work of Jean-Marie Lane, some of these compounds have never even existed before in the history of cosmos. They are beyond alchemy. Recently, the origins of life sciences have been paying close attention to dissipative structures as the drivers and programs that embody the transition of inert to living matter. They include a range of examples across a variety of scales, from crystal growth to dynamic droplets, whirlpools, birth of galaxies, minimal kinds of proto-life, and even life itself. Now, dissipative structures are non-equilibrium systems that are spontaneously formed by the massive flow of energy and matter through space. Think of a tornado. I think that's the why I've got it up there. Nobel Prize-winning chemist Ilya Prigogine in the 1960s first described them, and functionally they consist of an oscillator situated in an excitable open medium. And recently, the dissipation-driven adaptation of matter has been proposed by Jeremy England at MIT to support the emergence of lifelike phenomena such as self-replication. By considering dissipative structures as iterative events that may form the basis of a natural counting process, they may be viewed as a computational platform that directly interrogates rather than represents lifelike systems. This here is an example of a dissipative system that's been used in computation, the Belizov-Zhabotinsky reaction. It produces an excitable, multicolored set of waves that act as a nonlinear oscillator. The outcomes of such systems produce maps of events rather than theories of relationships, a form of ordering which Matt Lee calls oceanic ontologies. They are ascribed values and acquire the status of symbols. This particular map has been produced with the system that I've been working on over the last 5 years called the Büchli system. And they're literally a very simple, again, materially simple, set of lifelike dynamic droplets made from 3 molar sodium hydroxide and olive oil. And really, this is a topology. Again, this is diagrammatic. It is not engineering or technical. And it represents a spiral of complexity from which various morphologies and behaviors, and I've used a lot of metaphors to describe the fusions and expectations of these two systems. It's based on a series of well over 300 replicate experiments, all under the same kinds of conditions, in which I'm watching the very rapid evolution of a large palette of different kinds of typologies. And the reason for just simply grouping them like this is to start to orchestrate a way of thinking, imagining into these spaces, constructing languages that start to speak of this dynamic chemistry, rather than trying to freeze frame everything into a simple morphological slice that's taken across a period of time on an axis. How do we keep the liveliness and flux within a system that is constantly in production within our expectations of design? Now, such cartographies are already used in urban studies, where city growth has been likened to fractal formation, as in this metropolis image by Michael Najjar. And it's applied to better facilitate the organizational interactions between many diverse and complex agents, such as cultural events, technological systems, and communities. Now, building on Clay's approach for developing principles for lively design and enabled by the performance of dissipative systems, a strategic approach to developing visceral materiality of vibrant matter may be experimentally explored through design. The exchanges are orchestrated through a rich medium of material complexity, multi-materiality, and emergence to produce soft, living architectures. By applying a design set of programs and spatial tactics to choreograph the production of the underpinning oceanic ontologies through which design decisions can be shaped, the unfolding events of lively materialities can be mapped and engaged as unique experimental performances and happenings in which there are no predetermined outcomes or givens. The architectural infrastructures that generate these material symphonies that orchestrate soft living architectures include the interface. So what I'm doing is trying to create a set of parallels for Clay's claim to the line, the curve, the dimension, and an energetic state, whether it's chromatic or whether it's kinetic. So the four categories I would choose would be interface, oscillator, selective permeability, and massive parallelism. So the interface is produced where two fields of energy, or multiple fields of energy, and matter overlap to establish dynamic tensions within a site. Their enhanced potential for dissipative structures increases the potency of a locale. Oscillators provide an iterative body whose excursions read and map a site as a computational processor, as in this wave-like action that's on the Venice shore here. There's also selective permeability, which governs the performance of architectural agents and increases them when they're infused by an excitable medium that enables their loose, reversible coupling with many different kinds of bodies and multiple materialities. And the vast spatial and temporal processing power of the material realm through massive parallelism establishes differential programs, not just single programs that are played out in series, and design tactics that can support many simultaneous acts of material transformation. So to demonstrate the design principles in action, the following drawings were created by my students to produce soft living architectures experimentally. The experiments were set up during the dynamic chemistry and architectural design class at the Thinking Through Making 1 week of Material Design Week, which was held on the 29th of January at the Chemistry Outreach Laboratory at Newcastle University. Now, these principles are based on a system called the Liesegang ring system, which was developed by Raphael Liesegang in the middle of the 19th century, who was interested in developing light-sensitive gels for photography. Liesegang rings are spatial time-independent structures that are produced from the interactions between non-uniform fields of agents. Specifically, symmetry is broken by an initial spatial concentration gradient that prompts a wave of reagents to move through the system. Physical forces such as diffusion and gravity, and chemical transformations such as crystal precipitation and redissolution shape these interactions between the multi-material dynamic agents. The width and spacing of the bands of crystal precipitation varies according to a variety of starting conditions, such as their distance from the origin of the imposed concentration gradient. I'm quite taken by these rather enlightenment diffraction patterns of light that are moving through the bodies, which are actually also rolling in time and space. So there's a kind of four-dimensional, let's say, morphological transition that's going on. What you're getting is inorganic salts, divalent cations, so that's calciums and ions and nickels, brightly colored salts. And they're displacing sodiums from a gel-like material, so call that agar. Agarose is much better because it's not as cloudy. And what you're getting is, first of all, you're getting a displacement of the sodium by a divalent cation, which causes cross-linking of these polymer backbones, which causes a rolling and folding. So really, rather like a primitive streak in a neural plate in embryology, you're starting to get warping of the fabric of the gel. The second thing that happens is a diffusion of the divalent cations displacing the other salts in the surrounding through a series of, let's call it wave fronts, that result in complex salt formations, which can be extremely brightly colored. And all that is just because you've saturated and activated gel with these, simple salt-like solutions. It's something that's highly complex, but actually very simple to do. Now, the gel is the enabler in this system. It's an infrastructure that allows the movement of matter. It allows transition, temporality, intermediate states. It allows change within the system. Without the appropriate infrastructure, there is no transition. And so really one of the things that my students are engaging with is that if we want to work with life-like substances, then the supporting, nurturing infrastructures are equally as important as the active agents or the bodies that we, or the oscillators in this case, as the oscillators that we place within the system. So procedurally, the modified Liesegang ring experiment speaks of an origins of lifestyle transition that's unconstrained by naturalized aesthetics, where the qualia of interacting lively materials orchestrates new independent acts of creation. Now, of course, you have some degree of influence on this. It's a bit like gardening. We're familiar with these techniques. We don't have absolute atomic control, but what the trade-off is a sense of creativity, surprise, discovery, playfulness, and exchange. Students are always discussing, how they actually produced some of the effects that they get with other students, even though they're not expert chemists. So the actual art of drawing actually invites you into a space of unfamiliar, let's say, materialities, and allows you to invent and innovate in that space without necessarily having a formalized idea of what it is that you are proposing to produce at the end of the let's say, the journey of discovery. Now, I thought this was quite interesting because Stephen Jay Gould proposed that replaying the tape of life could test whether the natural realm had been generated through a dominant program, such as one produced by an omnipotent divinity, or the hylomorphic ideas that were expressed earlier. And Gould argued that if we lived in a predetermined universe, then biological species would be very similar to those that we recognize today. But if environmental influences played played a significant role in evolution, we might encounter seemingly alien forms of life, which are in keeping with those that seem to arise from the experimental fields of activated gels and enlivened materials within these set of very simple experiments. Poetically, then, the ensuing experimental events are read through the text of Paradise Lost to graphically discuss how this alternative nature is not of divine origin, but is born of a new collaboration between empowered matter and secular human agency, which share a common project in their mutual continued survival. By directly engaging the generative potency of the material realm, designers can move one step back from the traditional site of production, the predetermined, fetishized object, akin to God creating mankind fully formed from dust, the original hylomorphism. Instead of this sudden act of genesis in which the homunculus design object is preformed and valued through the geometry of its lines, its dimensions, curves, and energies of geometrically bounded materialities, as Clay suggests, the architectural move becomes an evolutionary, musical engagement between the multiple agencies, influencing the production of space. And I mention music because, you know, Bjork involves this in her biophilia project. She creates a lot of synchronicities between, let's say, our love of biology and the way that we produce music. So this choreography of material tension shaped by human and non-human activity generates an ongoing series of probabilistic events in which the designer is not redundant, but variably displaced from center stage of the design process. We can move towards center stage. We can control so much of the variables within these territories that there's a certain degree of predictability. And really what we're doing is giving ourselves a much greater degree of engagement with probabilistic notions of design. We're opening up opportunities for surprise, for delight, for poetry, for the unknown, to start to suggest to us as to what the design opportunities may be. And acts of creativity are distributed throughout the site through multiple material happenings that oscillate at interfaces as massively parallel operatic scores. In this way, architectural aesthetics are more than the most superficial acts of the design process, but are woven through deep material structurings that resonate back in cosmic time when, following the Big Bang, the first matter started to condense as chemistry. These ancient frameworks constrain the limits of material couplings, but not their creative potential. Indeed, they are enhanced by new insights and technical developments, such as the study of transitional states, production of quantum dots, and lifelike inorganic syntheses. The portfolio of possibilities for multi-materiality as substrate, technical platform, and co-designer of architectural tactics and design programs therefore becomes a rich and fertile terrain for designers. Ultimately, the architect becomes part of, and not separate from, the production of new kinds of nature. These opportunities do not stand alone as a set of material experiments, but can be combined with other frameworks, production platforms, and contexts, as is demanded of an ecological age of discovery. Multi-materialities may give rise to architectural typologies that are not most mature at the time of their installation. This is the context for modern buildings that slide towards entropic decay, as lively environments unravel neat geometries and homogeneous substrates. Instead, they create a context for the orchestration and enriching of material events that continue to be shaped by and alter the nature of their sites. Consequently, these architectural bodies are reinforced by time. Now, these dynamic spatial material systems may be thought of as soft living architectures that change with time and process discrete lifespans. And this is a slice through stromatolites. These are specific ones to Shark Bay. So, I mean, you know, the idea of lively materials that form what David Thomas Anstead called this great stone book of nature, you know, are archaeological, you know, geological scale events. And so, you know, this is not a fanciful proposition. It's really to do with our current engagement with the project of life as technical system, together with the insights that have been shared through recent scientific and design-led discoveries. So really the character of the soft living architecture is already known to us. We've experienced them mostly on much longer timescales. Potentially, we have the ability to engage with them on shorter timescales, but we don't know that yet, because I think that we're really at the start of an era of very interesting sets of exchanges, you know, within a whole range of practices that are sharing this project of life. Potentially, it's coming out of our neuroses about, you know, our own extinction, which, you know, comes about every single millennium and probably many times in between. But I think that the project of life is one that is seriously on the table. Potentially, we are not discussing it in the way that it seems to be taking center stage to our, let's say, cultural and technical agendas. So soft living architectures are sown, not manufactured. They arise all at once and are not built from a series of discrete parts, being provoked into existence as sudden dissipative seeds of organizing multi-materialities. This is Shark Bay, the stromatolites, tiny bacterial colonies that gradually die and leave the geology of their own, let's say, infiltrations from inorganic materials as the scaffoldings for the next generation of bacterial colonies. And so what we're seeing here are rock formations that are alive on the outside, a bit like coral reefs, really, that you've got large structural inorganic systems on the inside and very dynamic, temporally immersed soft scaffoldings on the outside. So each one of these is unique, and yet they're still recognizable. I mean, this is a characteristic of the dissipative structure. You can know, as a storm chaser, you know what a tornado looks like, but they're not all the same. It's very, very recognizable. Not only that, you actually feel the field of its effect. It exists beyond its own apparent body. You feel the winds of a tornado well before you actually reach the eye of the storm. There's a different quality of sets of engagements in actually working with some of these design substrates. They're semi-permeable to their sites. They do not have those discrete boundaries. Rather, they have their, borders. They're bordered, not bounded. And their complexity can actually be built up and mature with time. Let's call it more like the production of soil-like bodies that enfold new systems and forms of organizations into their being. They enable and facilitate their own permeability to mineral-rich flows. They generate organizing hubs that roll and fold to produce architectural scale metabolic organs which mutually shape the physiology of sites. Soft living architectures do not seek permanence or self-similarity, but over their active lifespans produce new morphological layers that deposit minerals in their bones, leaving behind new substrates for further growth, which do not require central spatial plans or deterministic programs. Instead, they bud off seedling fabrics and breed new architectures as a bespoke range of embryological events. Soft living architectures may senesce as they break down, but these errors are not terminal events. They are opportunities for the emergence of new programs. As one dissipative system collapses, it provides a complex material platform as a starting point of another iteration or cluster of lifelike events that collectively enrich environmental fertility. This is my new favorite subject, the diatomaceous earths. You may or may not have heard of them. Soils and earths are extremely interesting to me in the sense that they are a collective material that is produced by many different kinds of bodies. Diatomaceous earths are mainly produced by the silicon skeletons of diatoms, so they're tiny little algae. That because they have like silica frameworks, they hang lower than blue-green algae, which absorb different wavelengths on the top of the sea. And diatoms are browner, redder, and they absorb lower infrared wavelengths of light. This diatomaceous earth is just like really neat because it's like a squidgy limestone, and it's mined to put in your toothpaste. It's incredible. It's a beautiful substance. And what I find most appealing about the production of soils is that it's looking to form a maximalized form of complexity. So we've had a lot of scientific experiments, so like J. Craig Venter, looking to produce minimal life forms. How few genes can we squirt into a ghost yeast cytoplasm to make the thing jiggle around as if it might be life? Soils, for me, become almost the counterpoint to that. How many fabrics and how many different systems and how many different spatial events can we enfold into space itself through dynamic, complex materiality to produce relationships and new sites that are as rich and varied and robust as life itself? So in an ecological era, architects wield significant influence on the fabrics that are unique to this planet and collectively comprise a force capable of geoengineering scale impacts. They are simultaneously navigators, communicators, inventors, visionaries, and risk takers that are not afraid of the unknown. The new kinds of nature in which multimateriality thrives are deeply entangled with the NBIC technological convergence. That's the nano-info-bio-cogno convergence, an idea that was proposed by Rocco and Bainbridge for the National Science Foundation in 2003. Rather than layering green vegetation over grey concrete to achieve a new kind of urban efficiency, the grey technologies of smart cities are threaded into the green fibres of sustainable living materials, which for me are the biotechnologies, not necessarily your green plants. And out of this convergence, we may see alternative forms of intelligence, gastrulating architectures, production platforms through which a new kind of human development may begin to emerge. And within these placental unfoldings, new architectural strategies, programs, tactics are made available to ecological architects who use iterative, persistent experimentation to explore these terrains. Rather than seeking atomic levels of control, they embrace risk, provide a palette of lively multimateriality, and incessantly coalesce them to provoke new spatial experiences. Ecological architects work with fuzzy surfaces, cloudy vistas, fragile details, quantum logic, soft scaffoldings, and all kinds of teratogenic in-betweens that infiltrate the spandrels between the mineralized bones of architectural construction. Yet these nascent terrains and complex fertile substrates do not claim to produce totalizing solutions to the constantly unfolding multiplicities and challenges that we're facing. Rather, they catalyze new opportunities for invention by providing an emerging palette of new possibilities and paradoxes from which we may birth new kinds of architectures. In this way, the built environment shares a common project with the natural realm, the production of life's poetry and our mutual continued survival into an ever-unfolding adjacent possible that is full of surprises. Thank you.
Can I ask all the speakers to come up and we can start to kick off this conversation?
I like that blue simulation and processes ontology.
Andre? Is Andre still here? Maybe not. Okay, whatever. Okay, so thanks everyone for the presentations. I think in terms of being given a task by Kostas to try to synthesize a little bit and then to sort of create a kind of common ground for conversation, it would be interesting, I think, from my side. There were certain terminologies used, and based on the differences and distinctions of the presentations, it would be interesting for me at least to unpack a little bit some of this. And a couple of the terms in particular was I was interested in your individual interests or queries about the issue of control. I think that there is a certain kind of unsaid conversation to be had about the nature of control and how we actually exhibit it, demonstrate it, operate with it. And I think Lambros opened up, I think, a very important cultural perspective about the motivations behind that. So I think, I guess from my perspective, I would like to talk about control, about the issues of design and how you guys see that within your own practices, and to particularly speak also about this notion of the lifelike, because it was used, I think, in varied contexts, and I think in some sense, I guess the question for me is lifelike to who? Which I think is really important. I guess, let's say, for my own motivation, I would just sort of put on the table that I believe, anyway, that control is an illusion. And I put that as a provocation. But I put it out there before so that you understand the nature of my question. Should we go down the line? There's a little bit of a Greek contingency and other German kind of counterparts. And if we were able to gather everybody together and have a conversation, I think would be a better state of affairs today.
I mean, I agree with you. The question of control is very central, but as designers, I think control over matter is almost the premise of our discipline. And a large part of building the human artifice has to do with actually increasing the amount of control. It's an asymptotic process. You can never have complete control over something. But it also has to do with risk reduction. One part has to do with very pragmatic requirements in terms of risk reduction, predictability, the economy. The other part, which is more cultural, has to do with expression or projection of authorship or individuality. So by deliberately and intentionally controlling matter, you are fulfilling some psychological need as a designer, as a creator, to project something of your inner thought process in the actual outcome. And you can see this if you work in a group with other architects. There is big kind of resistance anytime that there is any kind of risk of releasing control or losing authorship. So I think it's part of design culture to an extent, and of Homo Faber as a program.
But do you see that as part of the motivation behind, let's say, the agendas of algorithmic processes that is being somehow implicated by this, right? We understand that there is higher ordering complexities with some of the designs that we're talking about. So I guess part of my question is about unpacking this idea of control. We're all talking about moving from models that are not finite and fixed into things that are allowing different processes to unfold. The question is, what is it within our own practices that allows us to actually understand those differences? And I think Ambros also said differences that make difference. Part of, let's say, the motivation behind a meeting like this, which I think is really important, is getting people that have seemingly points of connection based on a certain topic. And that begins an interesting conversational thematic, but it's also important to also articulate radical differences. And I guess that's basically part of how I'm trying to set up the agenda, because it's not clear for me, because I think it's really early in the process, that we have so much understanding of the processes that we're enabling. And I'm asking that not as a critique, but not to belabor the burden of some of these things to be sort of talked about and addressed in a way which assumes or makes a lot of assumptions that somehow that they're ready. Because we're talking a lot about promises, and I'm not really interested personally on the discussion of promise, but I'm interested much more in terms of understanding, let's say, the pursuit of, let's say, these kind of subjects relative to each of your practices. Because I think within that there is motivation behind it, right?
I'm not sure I understand your questions in relation to control. We do initiate processes whose outcomes we cannot exactly predict yet.
Yes.
But I think when these processes become viable alternatives to, let's say, construction methods or industrial methods, the degree of predictability will also have reached the level at which they are safe to use. So at the moment, at the level of experimentations, there is discovery yet to happen through this relinquish of control. But as these become part of the industrial complex, I think there will be an increased amount of predictability and reduction of this kind of unintentional behaviors.
Okay, so my understanding of control is quite simple. I think that digital fabrication tools give us a lot more control over how and where we can distribute materials. And equally, we have lots of simulation platforms now where we can do lots of sort of detailed analysis and sort of understand it that way. But I don't think that we have the control as designers to be able to manipulate complex objects. And I think that it's a fundamental problem of this representation. How do we want to control the objects that we're working with? How do we actually want to discover new forms of design? So, for example, Andre before was talking about these sort of low-level behavior of sort of control of materials. I mean, how even if we could simulate these with amazing accuracy and we could fabricate them, as designers, how do we put these things together and actually develop structures that have these sorts of amazing properties that nature does? And I think that's the issue of control, and that's the thing that we don't necessarily have. And I think that that's where we need to push forward.
So I think that control is one of those expressions that comes along with a linguistic problem, which is a symptom of industrial thinking. Neil Stephenson has written an excellent essay called Innovation Starvation, which I think was for the World Economic Forum, in which he talks about risk and safety being an illusion of the 20th century, in which he said that his parents witnessed the sudden appearance of planes and trains and motor cars, and then by the start of the third millennium, when we're totally immersed in our industrial age thinking, we have innovation being the discovery of a new app. And so for me, it's actually changing the goalposts in which I would like to be designing. So I'm not really interested in the modern project. I understand it exists. I engage with it. My passions are elsewhere in this messier, let's say, Scooby-snacked set of competing ideas, paradoxical experiences, moments of surprise. And rather than thinking about control, I think what it is more about is about setting limits of possibility. So when we think about, when we want to eliminate risk and think about safety and kind of control everything, what we're doing is we're really narrowing limits of possibility, as if we're in a scientific experiment, as if we could take away the complexity of the material system in which we're immersed. And for me, control becomes a question of not anything goes, because matter itself has a set of probabilities that are engaged in any act of design. What it's about is that the designer starts to understand how that system can be tuned to deliver a set of qualities or a set of design decisions that can be made that relates to their subject of interest or passion. So in a project in which it appears to be meaningful to the designer to go in a process of discovery, you kind of want broad limits of possibility. That doesn't mean it can be anything you like. You know, it's like making a cake. Okay, if you put eggs and sugar and flour and butter and mix it up, you understand that at the end of the day, you're going to get some kind of cake. Now, you may get limits of cake being a dirty black biscuit, which is my scale of the spectrum of cooking. My grandmother, on the other hand, produces fantastic, fluffy, delicious, must be eaten straight out of the oven kinds of cakes and gâteaux and all kinds of strange mixes. So, I mean, we kind of understand the phenomenon of cake and the spectrum of possibilities within that. As you do more cake, you know, your artisanry with the medium, you know, can engage with risk and experimentation in more constructive ways than saying, you know, just me throwing in the eggs and throwing in the flour and butter and whatever it can't be, I'll stick it in the oven, come back and go, oh my God, it's a dirty black biscuit. How did that happen? So I think that there's a kind of set of nuances when we think about this issue of control. I think I want to change the language in which design is framed so that design comes with risk. We accept that. But it's not just beyond our ability to meaningfully shape events, or choreograph, or create opportunities for discovery within that framework. But on the other hand, you know, you don't want to, you know, poison your audience or have a building that doesn't stand up. So it's really about, you know, how we deal with, you know, the limits of the portfolio that we are presenting, and that becomes part of the skill of the designer. So that's how I'd answer your question about control. It's actually something that we tune rather than we try and eliminate or factor out.
Yes, well, I definitely agree with what Rachel just said about illusion. I think that I see control as an illusion of modern individualism. It's very much a Western construction. It's a way of thinking and making sense about design. We definitely prefer to be in control of a situation. And we very often don't understand that we miss the participatory relationship, which is the basis of creativity. And that is not just a relationship between humans. It's a social relationship that you can have also with the material you use. And it involves a lot of risk. But this risk is always constructive because it is what allows you at the end to have a creative outcome rather than just one of the same things. So as human beings, we are able to have a sense of control as we have a sense of agency. And this is something that we have. Matter is not having this ability. But this is a belief, it's a kind of self-narrative we create as designers or as human beings, that we make things happen, we are in control of situations. Whereas in fact, in most of the cases, in my experience at least, and especially if you look at the issue of design and creativity over long, and from a cross-cultural perspective, and look at the evolution of design, the material is always active and always play a huge role in terms of what is happening. At the end of the day, you might well feel that you are in control, that you are the designer, that you are responsible for what is happening, so you can be happy and be proud for it. But most of the interesting things happen when you work with, not over the material, not against it. You learn from the material you use. And this is also, in my opinion, a more healthy and a more ecological way to approach and understand the process of design. I'm not sure if that...
I think there's another issue that it's not necessarily about thinking about, and I'm not saying you're suggesting it, but we're not necessarily bound to thinking about complete top-down control versus complete bottom-up control. I think there's a term that I like, which is programmable self-organization, and this idea that actually maybe there's this sort of middle area where we are manipulating, self-organizing processes, and that's where the sort of magic happens.
Well, yes, I mean, you have to take into consideration the medium you use. If we're talking about coding and computation, inevitably there is some kind of algorithm which is pretty much in control of certain aspects of the process. But if you think about design, generally speaking, I mean, in terms of how we make things, I mean, in some cases, you don't have much control, really. I mean, and a lot of the stuff that you presented before, they strike me as really, involving a great deal of risk and discovery rather than pre-scheduling and pre-planning about what will happen. And that's the way also ecology operates. And this interaction is something that I feel should find a way into the way we build and the way we think about those new technologies, maybe.
Although I would throw into the discussion, along with control, the question of intention and responsibility. So you have a human agent that takes responsibility of the thing that they make, and they have to imprint their intention to that thing. So I think there is a social value to control as well, because you have accountability in the end.
I mean, I could probably agree with most of the things being said, but at the same time, I think that there should be a little bit of an acknowledgement. We see algorithms being run in all aspects in life, right? When it's tied to materiality, there is a certain necessity for what you're suggesting. But let's say control and understanding is starting to slip away. For example, we understand in principle how to set some algorithmic processes at play, but they become black boxes. They give us results without really constructing an understanding. We iterate in a way to simulate models of things, and at times, with the orders of complexity, we start to believe that we understand complexity through simulation as a way that has a fitness criteria with the outside world. In this context, we're talking about materiality, but we're also talking about cultural production. We're talking about what the role of design is, because one of the promises of this is not the singular authorship. One of the promises is of a kind of collective intelligence that is co-producing things, which also puts not design in crisis. Actually, it liberates a kind of convention which has been very classical in terms of how we see the motivation behind what we do. And I think developing tools and making that more accessible to people is part of that process, obviously. But then having those tools being co-developed, and we start to see those things, becomes really interesting. But at the same time, they reinforce a kind of attitude of understanding that I feel is still like that kind of black box problem that we had, let's say, in the 50s and 60s, particularly with cybernetic thinking, that as a strategy, or radical constructivism, which basically was just alluding that everybody's relationship to the world was unique. And we would have to facilitate new frameworks to actually understand what we're really talking about. And I think that there is a need for a new language, but I'm not sure that language is the tool for this. And I'm not sure that materiality is, but for sure, like when we talk about lifelike processes, we can understand that materials have their own life cycles. We understand that they degrade. We understand that they transform. And I think in some way this meeting in between is a conceptual problem, because we will say we don't want to dominate the system, and we will say we're interested in generative strategies. But when, in this durational method...
But I think that is the design project, to know, so for me, the ecological era is interesting because there are many levels of engagement with, let's say, knowledge frameworks, whether, you're looking for absolute atomic control, whether that's important to you. You could say that, we can drive without actually understanding how a car works. So we can actually enter into systems at different levels, with different levels of engagement, and still create meaningful experiences from them. And I think that for me is the beauty of design in an ecological era. If the ecological era is about how do we take these many levels of engagement and start to choreograph them and overlap them in ways that have value and meaning which we can convey culturally. And I don't think there is a single output through which, it's not like the, a singularity or the theory of everything. I think that's very 20th century. I think that, that everybody does have something unique to offer and unique to understand, but there is a shared engagement that comes with that, which is why language is really important, which is why I think the internet has been the catalyst for this almost kind of a Tower of Babel set of opportunities that we're being presented with right now. And it's starting different kinds of conversations across disciplines, across cultures, across different geographies. I don't actually really find that problematic. I think it does mean that we have contested territories, and perhaps some events in the media where we're looking at how offended we might be by differing worldviews, differing knowledge sets, and differing opinions. Those require cultural and political responses in which we can continue the project of peace. And I would go very much along with Bruno Latour on that one, that modernism in some ways, or the modern project, has set up, a kind of a silent war in society in which, we have a dialogue of opposites in which, many hybrids that we can't discuss fall out of and create kind of further complexity which we can't deal with and we try to ignore, and create impossible situations for us. And he proposes that is actually a war on our psyche, and that we actually need, he proposes constructivist projects which might lead to different narratives for peace. But I don't think there's a final solution to all of this. I think that is kind of dangerous thinking in itself. I think what we need to be is continually engaged, mutually responsive, and kind of inspired by each other, but also aware of these real aspects of risk and safety and control and all the problematics. Nature is full of contested territories. Things die as well as live. And there are many cycles and there are many difficulties. And I think trying to factor out difficulties is perhaps sometimes when things go really badly wrong.
Sure.
Martin.
I've heard the word complexity used a lot by various speakers.
I didn't use it.
So the word complexity has been used a lot today, and it's almost the counterpart of control, if you like, or a corollary of control. I'm a computer scientist, so I have a very specific notion of complexity in terms of time or space or information content or surprise, if you like, or fractal dimension. But how is what you're talking about going to change? Do we need new notions of complexity? How will we know complexity when we see it? Will we need to broaden our definition of complexity when multi-materiality and our interaction with the material world is changed?
Well, yeah, I think we might well do need new understanding of complexity. And keep in mind that, at least in my view, complexity, although, as you said, comes out of cybernetic logic and can be associated with computationalism, the language of computationalists is not always the best language to express and to use as a vocabulary when you talk about design. I mean, it gives you something, especially when we're talking about digital technologies. Of course, it might be the basis, but it's just a starting point, and there are all sorts of very important dimensions that you cannot really express using a computational vocabulary, however complex it might be. And those processes, those dimensions are very often very, very important part of the process of manufacture, design, making, however we want to call it. And some of them are strictly emotional rather than have a quite different logic to try and express it in a computational language. It's almost impossible.
Okay, not necessarily computationally, but I mean, I guess to me the notion of complexity still needs to be codified somehow.
I mean, I think
in recent history of architecture, at least, and design, there was a misunderstanding and confusion between the complex and the complicated, and sometimes the complicated passed as complex. And I think that was a kind of problem in architectural discourse for a while, for the past 15 years. And it's interesting that you're a computer scientist, because I was almost 4 or 5 years in another conference in Los Angeles, and again, the designers were talking about complexity, and the computer scientists from the audience said, for us, complexity is a negative category, and actually all our work as mathematicians or computer scientists is to reduce complexity under layers of abstraction so that we can make the system manageable.
Yeah, there is a way of taking the flip side, if I can speak on behalf of just being another architect in the room. Like, so for example, if complexity was somehow misunderstood as complicated, now overvaluing optimization as a strategy for today is also the flip side of that. Because I think fundamentally we have to talk where complexity resides. Is it in the thing itself, or is it between things? Is it in how we explore these things, how it enables certain things? I think these are very, very important conversations, because somehow complexity, and another word which today is a bit viral, is intelligence. These are things that we have to really start to unpack. I think that it's really important, especially for a generation of people that are not talking without access. So if the 50s, 60s, and 70s were people thinking about computation without that accessibility, that's not the case right now. We have the accessibility without the thinking, if I can be really honest. Just being someone that is also embedded in this world. And I think sometimes we somehow overstep the distinctions of actually what terms we're actually exploring. And for me, it's kind of important to really just kind of put that out there, because at the end of the day, the role of the designer or the architect, or our relationship with materialities, we assume has changed. But to be honest with you, if I ask what the definition of multi-materiality is, I mean, every process is multi-material in some sense. We've had a certain kind of wave of thinking that has been monomaterial in its deployment, but even that is an assumption. So I'm just asking that because if we really want to sort of gauge where we are, we have to, like a litmus test, try to figure out what is really at stake in the conversation. And I think this is what becomes really important. It's not about a form of practice, it's about these frameworks that allow these practices really to engage each other in a creative, meaningful, in a friction environment at times, to be able to tease out actually what it is that we're really talking about.
I agree with you about what is it exactly at stake, because I'm actually all for semantic slippage. I mean, it helps us evolve ideas, it helps us communicate better. Things that start out quite dry, and let's say products of the rational and programmatic get let's say, given value and meaning, they become loaded and distorted by the fact that they are important and that we do derive new meaning from them. I mean, I think that complexity is deeply entangled with ideas about, I'm talking in a very vernacular sense, you know, with the ideas of ecology, with the ideas of process philosophy. I mean, there is a whole melting pot of exchanges that are talking about some kind of common project that we are engaged in, and I think it is really important that we continue to renegotiate what those territories are, and you know, and how we're entering into them. And at the same time, I think it's quite coherent and consistent for us to say we also want definitions of these things so that we can actually challenge assumptions. So I don't have a problem both with, you know, absolute definitions being constructed only to be torn down like straw men and reinvented through, you know, the pen of the next author or the next conference, because I think that's actually how we evolve and how we you know, create a new context, let's say, for human development.
Oh yeah, I think I was suggesting that we need to get beyond sort of mere information-based definitions of complexity. I think that's absolutely consistent.
Please. Do you wanna?
Thank you very much for your presentations. They were fascinating. I have a question for Rachel. Rachel, right? I'll start by saying that I like very much this idea of choreographing, orchestrating in a way, natural processes that already exist. We observe them and we could be intervening by guiding them one way or another, like the Turing reaction diffusion stuff,
Yep.
choreographed into some purpose that we define, right? I understand this correctly. I understand this model, this medium, as opposed to the one that you put clay in a mold and you compound it and you make a brick and then you build with that. I like this a lot. McLuhan says that if we are to interrogate a medium, we need to push it to its extreme to see how it would work and how it would serve. And this is the predicament I'm in right now. In the 60s or 50s, when Buckminster Fuller was doing his studies about the microscale stuff and he was scaling them up to make bigger structures, the basic criticism was that this is out of scale. Gravity at that level is not the same as gravity at this level.
Yep.
So there was this problem there. And I'm wondering whether this paradigm of choreographing natural processes are also out of scale. And I'll try to push it to an extreme. My wife is expecting another kid, and I need to expand my house from a 2-bedroom to a 3-bedroom. So I have a few options. I can genetically modify bacteria in order to build me one extra bedroom. What they would be doing in 100 years, they have to do it in 9 months. So I have to intervene there to make them go faster. I can genetically modify my wife so that she will be pregnant for the next 100 years, but I think that would piss off my wife. Or I can choose not to have a kid, or I can accept that this natural process takes forever, so I'm not going to be able to have in the time frame I want my room. In other words, the technologies we're using and the kinds of concepts and the kinds of controls we want go hand in hand with the way we structure societies and the way we structure our needs, and they go hand in hand. So today, 2015, I have this problem. So as a futurist, as a person who looks into the future, what kind of path, if there's a fourth one, please tell me, would you choose in order to validate that choreographing as a valid process?
So I mean, I think the job of the designer really is to choose the appropriate material technical system. You know, have the correct vision, let's say, to help engage. You know, the challenges that you're faced with. And I would say probably, you know, you're better off knocking down the wall and making yourself an extension. But what I guess what I'm trying to allude to is really an expanded portfolio for architects, that we're at a very nascent period right now. But I do think that they're scalable. I just don't think that we've solved it all right now. So for example, soils are huge bodies. I mean, they are the size of countries and continents. And that these things really are produced as collective projects. But one could also see that cities are on the same kind of scale, let's say, as our fertile soils on Earth. So that if our cities, if we started to imagine piece by piece, cities as soil-producing systems, that realistically within, let's call it 50 years, that the city could actually be a soil-generating system, reappropriating and recycling or processing plastics within our homes, releasing them into, let's say, fertile fabrics, which are either used on the top of our roofs rather than taking rare bog earths, or are actually kind of used as a currency in which the, let's say, the enriched fertile terrains of the planet are being expanded rather than reduced by building concrete and tarmac on them. So I think that there is a sense of, let's say, appropriateness for what it is that we're trying to achieve. But I think what's happening is that we're able to engage in new ways of imagining possibilities rather than having to produce everything in 3 to 5 year cycles. I think what's nice is to think of the 100-year project. You know, how do we actually start a series of questions in which upcoming designers actually help enrich the ideas and maybe even change directions in the choices and, let's say, programs that we're making? How do we keep these collective projects open? I mean, I think it's a way of thinking, first of all, and I think that out of those discoveries will come, you know, I mean, it's like Ada Lovelace. 100 years before her ideas about what a computer program might be could actually be realized, you know, in Alan Turing's age, through a computer system that could actually make meaning of some of the ideas that she had. And I think that, you know, our expectations of temporality perhaps create distortions in our expectations, so that we end up with, I guess, lots of speculation in design, and I've got no problem with that. But ultimately, there's a point at which speculation alone starts popping the suspension of disbelief. And you start going, yeah, well, that's a nice idea. It's just a form of entertainment, which is what Bruce Sterling would call it. He would kind of say speculative design is a form of entertainment and really no more than that. Well, I think we're actually at the next stage of that, where we're actually becoming very propositional about, you know, working with technologists, working with you know, communities of interested participants, and actually forging new projects together. I think the nature of these is not yet sorted, but I think the kinds of things that are probably going on in the collective imagination for which these are appropriate are perhaps environmental systems that perhaps work differently with the plastosphere, where we may be growing new soil bodies in open waters to create floating islands in which, you know, new colonies of birds might live safely. Or that we, like I say, I mean, you know, looking at cities that produce soils, or that we're looking at, you know, how we might construct, you know, social spaces out of, you know, things that we would normally throw away. So I don't think there's a ready-made in terms of, you know, this is what it's going to solve. But I think thinking into those imaginative spaces, particularly as we become concerned about the relationship that we do have with nature, and I think that probably all civilizations have that concern, but I think it's a conversation that's actually highly productive in terms of the communities, shared projects that we could forge together, technical systems that we might be able to design, a form of exploration into the unknown, you know, maybe a kind of new frontier of sorts, new intelligences, new bodies, new kinds of life, you know, and that we're part of this exchange. So I don't think there's something to be fixed as such, and I think you need more space.
I think Francis has a question in the back.
Yes, first.
Sure, go ahead.
I just had a quick question for Lambros, basically. This kind of example that you mentioned about kind of 70,000 years or so ago of people actually inventing this new material that the kind of use of which kind of generated new thinking, a new kind of culture around the production of these materials. How do you see that in kind of a much more contemporary kind of fast forward like time, where actually at the moment what we're doing is we're trying to generate and create new materials using very kind of fixed interfaces, either digital or machinic, in order to manufacture that material. And all of these kind of processes that we use are very compartmentalized. The computer is one, the machine that will make material is the other, and then the material construct is what comes out of that. Could that kind of potentially generate a new type of thinking or a new type of culture similar to the example that you gave earlier on? And if that is not the case, could multimateriality kind of enable that in a more synthetic type of thinking, if that makes sense?
Well, I do think that there is a tension, a productive tension between the material and the mind, if you want, and that is the basis of evolution, if you want. So you come up with this, you engage new material, and this engagement will shape the way you think, will have an impact on your evolving ability to think. Even, don't forget, even language is a product of evolution. I mean, we don't take nothing is for granted from an evolutionary perspective. Everything is emergent as part of the process. So the material will influence your thinking, and your thinking will influence the way you go on and produce new material. And this kind of dialogue is part of this process we've discussed today. This is what multimateriality is. If it's something new, then it has affordances that will produce new stuff. By new stuff, I mean energies, I mean ways of thinking, I mean being together of ability to manufacture new things, construct new ideas of space and time. All those kind of things can emerge out of this new blending. But the blending I have in mind is not just between materials, it is not the multimateriality, it's also your engagement as a human being with this multimateriality, which is really, really important as an individual, but also as a society. And this explains why I don't really go for the idea of control we described before, because for me everything is about emergent properties. It's a dynamical system, and in a dynamical system, you don't really control. Even if you feel you control the situation, actually, emergent properties will occur. So what will happen at the end is probably, it's part of history, it's not part of your planning very often.
Can I give an example? So the BIQ house that Arabs just constructed in Hamburg is a facade system that actually contains living bodies of algae. So, they're little green cows living between what's effectively a double glazing system. They feed in sunlight and carbon dioxide. They produce biomass. That biomass is harvested, dried, burned back within the building. Now, what is likely to happen out of that very simplistic set of exchanges is, one, we will see more microagricultures within cities. That will necessitate a different water infrastructure system. It will necessitate semi-permeability to water within our built environment, which is a very dry place right now. And that we will start to see semi-permeable bodies and houses and living spaces constructed as a result of, just one, let's say, a prototype dwelling. And I just want to make a kind of a comparison with when steel was first used in the construction of bridges. Designers and engineers were still making dovetail joints as if they were made of wood. So the very first bridges for the Industrial Revolution were built with the same kind of tool set that you would build a wooden bridge out of. It wasn't until about 80 years later that we kind of cottoned on to the idea of the tensility and the original properties of steel. And that's what I think that we're going to see with these microagricultures starting to infiltrate our living spaces. There's going to be different ways of looking at health and safety, the production of food, what it is that an architecture provides the community of life within it, and that may not necessarily be seen to be exclusively human.
Francis?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on the question that was asked to Rachel earlier about, well, a couple things you said in your presentation. If I misinterpreted you, I apologize. The first was that it seemed that the argument was largely built up on manipulation of matter through energy, and you'd given a kind of idealized example in which this organism extracting itself at end of DNA. And it seems to me like the power in biological systems is the ability to kind of encode information format like DNA, which could be a memory, which is capable of cultural evolution. It seems that building dependencies, which you've always done on energy-driven systems acting on matter, there's a problem with that. For one, we've been doing that and we've been badly because we can't manage the whole network of ecosystems and effects. We're very bad at predicting that. And we can't build computational optics that can control without, and any energy-based system will eventually dissipate its entropy. So I'm just curious why you would say that the absence of genetic information would be important.
So it's important because it's actually enriching our understanding of liveliness. So Darwin himself didn't propose that genetic information was the answer to the relationship between organism and environment. And yet, he described a reciprocity between, an organismal being and its environment. Mid-20th century, we come up with this idea of encoding and DNA, the rise of modern computing. We make an awful lot of analogies between the two systems. Before that, we've had a whole range of Russian biologists and embryologists looking at, lively matter. I mean, let's go back to 1830s. Kind of the early experiments where we're trying to disprove vitalism. The homologies between lifelike chemistries and biology is a very long-standing thing. And in some ways, we put our DNA blinkers on in the late 20th century because we determined that one, structure is the most important thing. And secondly, digital code is something that we can really, 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 really work with, and we can work with very well. And therefore, we give that a great deal of weight and priority. But there's a whole politics of, let's say, alternative strategies for liveliness. So Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewinson would be, the kind of arch advocates of, let's call it, a leftist philosophy of life that doesn't rely on the selfish gene and the kind of the neo-Darwinist program as being the Übermensch of existence. That it's actually looking at forms of engagement with environments. Their famous essay would be the spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian paradigm. So there's been a long discussion about what makes lively stuff lively. We haven't sorted it. There will be many more conversations. I guess what I was trying to do was to tune into a new wave of thinking. Like I was saying, Jeremy England out of MIT is getting a lot of, attention for this idea of another kind of way of ordering non-equilibrium systems in a meaningful way that increase their vitality.
Doesn't it come down to a question of infrastructure for control? Because we have really powerful infrastructures for controlling things that operate similar to DNA.
I don't think it's a simplistic I don't think there's a simple answer. I think it is, the word that you picked up on, choreography. I think there are many, many different influences. I think when we try to find simple, overarching, grand narratives, I think that's when we start to, let's say, become over-programmatic about what it is that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, but as a futurist, I think you have to look at trends in culture to make predictions moving forward. And I don't know, it seems presumptuous to throw out in kind of impact.
But who said I threw it out? I mean, what I'm talking about, I mean, the ecological age for me is about how do we overlap many different paradigms of thinking. That would include modernism, that would include genetic codes. I think that Evelyn Fox-Keller is actually right. What we think of as being the gene in the late 20th century isn't what we think of as being the gene in the early third millennium. You know, our ideas about what it is that we're actually designing and dealing with are evolving continuously. So therefore, I think, you know, hanging on, you know, very tenaciously to kind of words and particular projects is actually, you know, a step backwards in the, you know, in our understanding of what it is that we're immersed in.
I think Lambros wants to jump into that.
Yeah, just one comment. It is important, I think, to clarify that the old-fashioned idea of DNA as a kind of fixed blueprint that lies at the base of growth is mistaken. I mean, no biologist nowadays seriously think of genetics in this way. We do know the role of epigenetics, and we do know how important ideas of niche construction, which are probably more ecological, a more, you know, distributed and ecological way to think about evolution. But the old-fashioned thinking by means of neo-Darwinian ideals is no longer the case, and we need to find a different way, a more dynamic way maybe to think about development and to think about evolution from a developmental ontogenetic perspective in this dynamic sense.
Which I think is happening, right? Yeah. With like these greater synthesis projects like EvoDevo and other aspects, there is a purposeful kind of belief that these different sciences actually have to at least start to share a kind of framework that they can be evaluated not as separate strategies of understanding, but actually are really trying to go back to this idea of trying to find a meaningful kind of communication between things. I'm interested actually, if it's okay, to ask Panayotis a question, because I think I understand your predicament, which is one that I share. At the same time, you're trying to create a framework for people. You have to make it accessible, and you develop it with a strategy of the known. But particularly for me, my question to you is because what you showed was amazing, and I say that with great sincerity, because of course, and you made a distinction which makes me allow me to say that from a personal level, which is, you said control was something that was important, but you knew that you wouldn't achieve it. Or I'm somehow paraphrasing what you said, which I think is really important. The desire to move towards that is very important, because that's where accountability and motivation somehow self-regulates the designer with its own motivation. But I'm curious, as someone who's building tools for people, which I think is a very, very important practice today, how do you try to speculate further from how an existing practice is being implemented, which is, I think, where the current tool is? And let's say, for example, the question of bringing up someone like Buckminster Fuller, when he set the project of himself, he said, I give myself 50 years. And I see it through a framework which I look at all problems of the everyday through that framework, which is, I think, why Fuller for me is a very important figure, mostly because of his motivation behind what it is that he's doing. And I think particularly with our dependencies of tools to understand and to simulate as a way of responding to things, it's becoming more increasingly motivated, I think, for the tool developer, I think, to first and foremost not talk about the tool, but really to talk about the thinking that underlies the premise of the development in the first place. We know that there is a lot of platforms and frameworks that we could use now, which 10 years ago or 15 years ago are not there. But the level of intellectual inquiry, I think, is something that we have to somehow raise the game, right, in some sense. And I'm just kind of curious from your perspective as being someone that's very intimately engaged in this and also being a teacher, how you see that in the work that you're doing, not for now, but let's say for a 5-year experiment of your own.
So for me, at least, tool development is not seen as separate from design itself. So if we take Hannah Arendt's approach to Homo faber, which is this endless chain of means and ends that are repeating. So it's just one link in these endless chains. And in that respect, I don't, my approach with tool making at least is not to pretend that I'm making a generic tool, that it can do everything or it can do a lot of things. There is a very strong point of view in the tool, and it's my point of view there. Sure. Influence, of course, I'm not a singular entity. I'm, of course, connected to the wider culture and civilization and so on, so okay. But I try to take, let's say, responsibility and authorship of the tool and create kind of idiosyncratic tools, idiosyncratic interfaces. There are other examples that I didn't show today that try to actually limit the possibilities within the tool to create a language, a reduced language for the designer who interacts with this tool. And this is also pedagogical because through using this type of tools and processes, we are learning about the systems. The fact that we understand intuitively certain processes in dynamic systems nowadays has to do partly with the interaction and increased exposures to simulations of these effects.
But it's also, you're speaking as a tool developer who uses the tools for a very authored design. And as a tool enabler, to allow other people to use that tool, they don't have those same affordances that you have with it. And I say that because a big part of the conversation, particularly when it comes to the software aspect of things, is really underlined with the idea that we are importing tools of other industries and making the assumption that that is very important. And it is, but it underlies now a different kind of responsibility, which is also about sort of not accepting practice, at least this is my opinion, not accepting the way that things are and the world that operates today with the forms of production that we're inhabiting. And it actually means speculating from a very constrained perspective how we can actually progress this, because there's no one in this room who's an architect who's going to think that we are operating in a world of high-level, high-technology implementation and design today. Or maybe they are, but I'm going to be really honest, from a very personal perspective, I think people are fooling themselves. Not from an architectural perspective. And I think it's important to at least put on the table what is at stake in terms of what it is that we're really trying to do. Like, I think that's where speculation becomes a very important tool, because we can make the argument that science fiction has become fact. And we may be talking about a kind of accelerated strategy. You mentioned McLuhan. He's very famous for one of his isms talking about, if you're interested in the future, look to the present, because we live in the past. Which is also interesting. Like, the present today, and especially with the conversations about ecology, there was an interview with James Lovelock, Mr. Gaia Theory, maybe 2 weeks ago on BBC, and his solution space when he was asked about the problems of ecology had nothing to do with design. He said it had to do with population. And his problematizing of the situation is that humans have the capacity to adapt, but we're wasting our time designing solar cells when the problem has degrees of magnitude which are much higher. And he continued the conversation and saying population has to be slimmed down by 2/3. And he continued the provocation that we have about 20 years to actually work on this project, and we're wasting it on things that don't matter. And I'm not suggesting that he's right, but I'm being honest with you, it's not a bad kind of provocation to have as designers operating today.
I think releasing a tool, I can see it more as a controlled experiment in a way. So I don't really know how it's going to be used and what the outcomes or misused or the outcomes would be, and what the discoveries will be through that. There is a degree of discovery there. So I think even in a very constrained, rigid computational tool, there are degrees of freedom that allow a lot of multiplicity to emerge. And that's why I see it more as a controlled experiment, something that you release to the world and then observe how people use it. But although I have my own thought process and preconception about how it could be used, I always see things that I would have never done with this tool, and I think that's the interesting part. And I also find, where my approach to interface design, which imposes a particular language that resonates with my own thought process, clashes with the thought process of other designers.
Sure.
So these observations are interesting to me.
Yeah, I'm just basically saying that I think I agree with your comment that tool making is design as much as anything else. I'm just saying that in your case, for example, and I'm not trying to call you out because Dan was talking about certain things and as well, and I think that these are all very meaningful things. I'm in the business of doing that not too far from here on the 3rd floor of Morwell Street. But I think that there is some aspect about where the motivation can go. Because I remember actually distinctively bringing someone like Casey Reyes to the DRL. This was about 10 years ago, and we were doing reactive graphics using Flash server and this kind of stuff, and they interpreted his kind of beta processing stuff in the same way because of visual representation. And so it didn't actually mean very much to some of my students at the time. But they missed the big point, which was that designing a tool for designers to have accessibility to certain ways of thinking about programming was fundamentally the motivation of the project, which I think was really important. It was very exciting for me that someone thought that that was a meaningful project, and I think had an amazing amount of influence. And processing, I think, is one of those things where if you look at someone like Karsten Schmidt, his libraries enable that to be more than graphics, to deal with physics, to deal with these things, and it has an amazing influence when you see some of the presentations today. So I'm not judging, or I'm just underscoring, I think, the value of the people that are actually open source creators instead of open source users. I try to make that distinction because I think there is something about design that should be much more shared and collective, and I do think that that's very important. And I think these gestures, because it was made a point, I think are really important because they have a great influence from a learning perspective, from an education perspective, and it will actually force production and infrastructure and material thinking to change, but by design. Because right now, 3D printing is kind of talked about on the promise, but if we are really clear, even in the presentations, we will always build within the box, right? All the presentations of multi-materiality basically are saying that we have to expand the volume, and somehow we make that more appropriate to architecture.
It's just a selection of language in the end. And that is something, if I can we ask questions to each other?
Of course,
okay.
I think, to be honest, I didn't ask Kostas
what I was going to do. I want to direct a question to Lavros, which is related. Because to a large extent, I agree with his criticism on hylomorphism or the hylomorphic regime or thinking process. And it's very reminiscent of the criticism that Kojin Karatani does in the architecture as metaphor, where he says that architecture as the art which is responsible for the direct materialization of the ideal form is a false perception. And it's an extreme criticism of architecture as this kind of metaphor. On the other hand, and intellectually I'm very attracted to this criticism. On the other hand, as a designer, because I don't have direct access to the material I'm working with, I have to work through representations, and I have to think about it in language, then I have this problem that I do impose different types of idealization to the system by necessity almost, right? So we would really like to have this direct access to the real of the material and its flows and complexity, but on the other hand, we have to think about it and work with it through representations and abstractions. And so we can criticize hylomorphisms, but I always think that it pops up by necessity in our culture.
Yes, well, I think I mentioned before that it is the nature of the medium that you work with as you said, it's about representation, and as Alexandros said also in his presentation, representation is always an abstraction. That's the representation. So you don't really engage the material, so the element of risk might be more, you know, it gives you at least the sense that you can control things. But I mean, the reason that you use the tool you use is at some point to make it happen, to make it a process in the real world, not just a program, right? And in that transition, you will have to engage the material or the multi-material of the future, and then you will have to maybe find a new language or at least a new way to explain the process that you will see happening in real life, in real time. So yes, I do recognize that inevitably you'll have to work with the presentations. I'm just saying that, okay, but why we cannot distinguish between this medium which is about representation maybe, but something else which is not really representational, and find a way to work with different tools and different media to construct what we.
But that's the problem right now, is that there is no large-scale building technique that you can have direct access to at the moment. So everything happens through representations. Right? So there's a current state of civilization and of development of technology. Seems that no matter how much we criticize this paradigm, is our almost only option at the moment. And the only thing that we can do as designers or developers of tools is to be selective about the mode of reduction or abstraction, basically.
No, Yotis, I think you should be more empowered, at least in this context anyway. Because, for example, I don't think that we work in modes of representation as explicitly as you think, and I don't think you do either. I mean, it somehow underlies the way that architecture has been going on about its business from the beginning. And actually, if there is an argument to be made about doing these things, we're not trying to represent things in terms of how we illustrate stuff. We're trying to make things operational because we're trying to communicate with machines, with forms of production. Our communication protocol is as much towards machines with other machines, as much as it is with clients or
With us.
people.
Yeah. Us, the same person that represents is the same person that receives.
Sure, I mean, this is like the kind of almost second-order conversation about the observer relative to design. That if it's a pencil or if it's a piece of code or whatever, at the end of the day, it's a conversational mechanism that I create to create.
So what I was getting to then, it's not that I think the problem is the tools in terms of the digital medium as a representation or the traditional techniques of representation in architecture, but language itself.
But I think, like, let's say, from a design perspective today, our motivation should be to demonstrate that it's beyond a representation. I mean, at some sense, even in the language that we choose to use the terms of thinking through prototypes, right? To prototype a certain feature, to explore things in a certain way. These are not necessarily just representations. They are real, embedded, making as a form of thinking, which I think was something that was teased out a bit in Lambros's conversational piece, which I think is something that's very undervalued, particularly in the way that things are sort of operated in today.
Can I just add to that? Because I think that in this form, in terms of when we think about multimateriality and these sort of complex systems, I think that the term representation isn't just about the image of the thing, and it completely encompasses the prototype, and it's the interface between us and the final thing. It's that entire sort of mediation process, and I think that's when I'm talking about representation. We need new representations. That's what I mean. I don't mean that we need new ways of visualizing or communicating it. I mean that fundamentally ways of mediating between the idea, the material, and everything. And I think that that's the important bit.
Yeah, but you also are underscoring processes that are iterative. And as a designer, we're not going from formula to objective, because architecture, when we talk about complexity, has to deal with people. So the objective is not to create in a fixed form a form of representation of that. I mean, what I'm saying is that this whole process, when we talk about this dynamic kind of design process that you're working through, and when you guys talk about the difference it takes in time to calculate, these things are meaningful to you. They're meaningful to us, meaningful in terms of actually operating with production as is, because all of that stuff is considered, right? There's economies attached to that. There's realities to it, which I think are very important in sort of enabling a demonstration of this. But I understand what you mean in certain ideas of representation, but within the context of architectural design, things have changed radically. It's not that the digital has brought a difference like Negroponte thought when he did the architecture machine group. I mean, it was for the novelty of CAD systems. And yet at the same time, someone like Christopher Alexander, whose idea of the vernacular was not by chance picked up by Minsky and Seymour Papert and given as reading. Like pattern language had one design criteria for why it was written, but it had another influence because of how it was thought, the logic behind the thinking. So I'm just saying, like, this conversation, particularly because we're talking about architecture, but it's not the architecture that we've talked about in the past. Or if I should suggest, it's not the architecture that we should have talked, with a kind of continuum that basically suggests that whatever habits we had in the past are still valid with the processes that we're talking about today. I mean, I don't think that that should be a fundamental assertion on our part, because we are trying to respond to an industry that's 100 years old in its thinking. But it's in practice is asking us to work much faster and in a much more accelerated way, right? Please.
Well, we are trying to discuss multi-material architecture. I don't know if the term could be
Incorporated.
Massaged into becoming something, but you associated multi-material architecture with multi-material 3D printing in a negative way, or you said it's not necessarily that. I will agree 100% that we're not talking about a specific medium of construction, whether it's going to scale up like switch and so on. That is not what would define multi-material in architecture. Multi-materialism started from an acknowledgement from the architectural community, in my opinion, that there is this technical capacity today to make materials that vary their properties locally. These are composite materials, these are natural materials, all these kinds of things. They have one thing in common. We can view them as monolithic things that have variable material properties in their interior. And in my opinion, what happens because of this, beyond the technical efficiencies, save material and so on and so forth, they change the model of thought about the way architecture is practiced and about the way architecture is thought. And in my opinion, again, this is like a very...
I like it.
I think the shift is like we can no longer think of architecture as a composition, which has passed since a long time ago.
Yes.
We cannot think of architecture as an assembly necessarily. This is starting to go away. The model of negotiating an object with its environment, which I think started in the 90s, officially done with Greg in this pliable thing, I think is fading away as well, because the opposition on object and environment is no longer valid. Look at Latour, for example. I think that architecture today, and that maybe perhaps the multi-material architecture could claim that as its own kind of premise, is that it is about designing environments as whole things. It is about designing whether it's natural live processes or dead things, it is about designing environments, because whether we like it or not, when we design a building and we excavate, we also displace ants, and therefore we also design the way where the ants are going to go. And as I have said, I've written somewhere else, in my opinion, the idea of architecture today is like to think of an exterior envelope of a building as the interior partition of an environment, as the us and that into thinking of the whole thing as one, and just our buildings or our cities are just chunks, just like scoops of that bigger environment, some of which we have control of, some of which some other we don't have control of.
Yeah, I think also, because I like the provocation. So for example, if that's, no, but the feeling that it was negative on my part, it's not negative. I just think there are things that need to be discussed. So for example, this idea of printing a house. Thomas Edison had that in 1890. He was trying to print a house in a day. His idea of printing a house in a day was casting a house in concrete in a day. Yes, it was a very failed project. And it's why it didn't happen. We fast forward, maybe, I don't know, it was something like 12 years ago when I met Baruch Koshnevitz at UPenn. And he was talking about contour crafting and this idea of printing a concrete house. His objective, to print it in a day. His interest from the architectural community, I can print all kinds of forms. The reality, from a material perspective, is that we have slumping, we have all of these other aspects, but the excitement was about printing. Fast forward another 12 years, and we're talking now about the first 3D printed houses that have been done in a day, a building in 15. We don't actually talk about the building. We don't actually talk about the processes that have actually been embedded habitually about what it means to actually exercise those technologies within the form of, let's say, what constitutes a house or an apartment building. So the qualification of where complexity and design relative to these things is something that has to be interrogated, because you're right that I think everybody here fundamentally is not responding to the 3D printers as they are. But I would suggest that in part they are, because either of necessity or of thinking, they're building tools to respond to printers as is.
I didn't see this today. I didn't see people making tools for printers. I saw people.
I'm not saying that that's a negative thing. I think that's a very important thing, because for all the guys who are making printers, they suggest that this is going to be distributed and everybody's going to have one in their house. But what fundamentally they don't say is the fact that if they think that everybody is going to be designers, then that part of education is really by necessity should be taught. And I'm totally for that as well. I'm not interested in a kind of, personally, holistic idea of this, because I think it fundamentally comes with the idea that an environment is somehow self-constructed. And in some sense, you could make the argument conceptually that my environment is. But when we're talking about culturally, it has a collective kind of implication, which I think is not only important, it needs to be somehow brought back into the conversation. So for example, if we're talking about the digital materiality today, what is that we're talking about? It's not about literal materials, and it's not about digital processes. It's something else. Because that conversation has evolved from the 90s. From just using tools and nerve surfaces and blobism and all of this. But the question is, what does it really evolve to? That's an open question. I don't think that we have an answer, and I don't mean to judge anybody. I'm being really honest, so my comments are not loaded with that. But I'm just basically suggesting that there is a real necessity to think, what is the difference really of multi-materials? I mean, for example, in the concept of assemblies, we're always dealing with two materials that have to interface, a window and a brick wall. Has that changed in terms of the notion of a boundary of two materials, even if it's at the micro level? I mean, the question, yes. Okay, fundamentally and authoritatively, you say yes. And I would say that's interesting. And let's see if it makes a meaningful difference. A difference that makes a difference. Because right now, I think the conversation is really at the beginning. And I'm not burdening it with anything more than that. But I think it's important to acknowledge it, because otherwise people think that we can go out and print the world. And realistically, even if we could, you know, the level of the intellectual engagement of what that would mean is really low right now.
Yeah, but you're taking the bad side of things. You're taking the
No, I'm taking the complete optimist, but one that is also in the business of trying to make things happen.
But for example, Francois Roche
Yes.
is also thinking about 3D printing, and he builds this thing called the things that necrose. So in his processes of depositing material in space, he includes a chemical thing that interacts with the environment, and that thing dies eventually. So
Yes.
his ability to print goes with embedding into the thing that eventually it's going to die. So it's not the 3D printing and the design process for him at least, and I think of him as a good example.
Yes.
It's not, one thing is not irrelevant to the other. So yes, we can criticize the one-day concrete house, but we shouldn't stick to that. We should stick to the good side of things. Yes.
I'm all for good. I'm a supporter and a champion of the good.
Yes.
I think
Unapologetic.
I kind of agree with this point of view that there's a very kind of large aspect of the idea of multi-materiality that is related to architecture and how it can affect space and physical form, which for some reason I think, there is a reason, the fact that these things haven't been done yet. Like, so it's therefore for us to speculate on what the implication they can have on architectural space. But I think even more kind of, I'm throwing this in the conversation as well. Even more interesting is the fact that we are kind of thinking of how we can design with multi-materials, but using a representation of it, which was kind of discussed there. So that kind of brings the question of what is digital materiality in that sense? If we're using a representation for materiality, then how can we say that we are designing for materials in the computer? Because what we're dealing with at the moment is colors. It uses colors that have some properties, but these properties don't relate to material properties. So I think this for me is
this is a mental mapping that you do. It's a convention that you are using. It's not only about the computer. It's when you draw lines on a paper and you say this is a wall. This didn't come naturally. This was a process of hundreds of years of development of conventions about representation, plan, drawing, what is a section, perspective, all sorts of things that came to us to be able to draw a line and say this is a brick wall, right? But it's graphite on a paper. It's not a brick wall, of course. So it's not only about, I don't buy this digital materiality, I don't know what it means, so I don't understand it. But I'm saying that we are creating conventions, and what digital tool enables us right now is to actually tweak these conventions and actually create our own kind of idiosyncratic language or conventions through which we design. But the mapping is just in our mind.
But if we going back to this idea of homomorphism, if we move away from that, and we kind of, as we try to illustrate today, there's a shift towards an understanding of design and construction that is purely materially based, then I would guess going towards that, we need to move away from conventions and use materiality into the
I don't think there's this purely material based doesn't exist. There is the fact that we are building, the act of building, of making, requires a culture, requires human agency. It's not, I think, this purely interaction with the material, unmediated, and it doesn't exist, I think.
But still, the human agency, in a way, has been moved out of the equation, because what we're using at the moment and what we're doing is we're using machinery to construct this material. Therefore, we don't really interfere or engage with the material itself ourselves. What we do is we use interfaces to control other interfaces that control the material.
Well, you can say that also about doing it with your own hands. Again, you're using your brain who controls your neurons, who control the... It's like...
But the issue of scalability then comes to the forefront.
This whole idea
Right?
about slippage and what you read into the paradigms that you're using. I think as designers just need to be aware of what system of kind of understanding that we're actually using to observe something, understanding how another way of observing, maybe through a more material-based culture, and having a look at where those parallaxes are and what that tells us about the possibilities. And that's why I think it's a really exciting age where, this kind of potential condensation of all kinds of different ways into let's say. I think maybe the agenda is a different paradigm for human development as a project. You know, can we have more nurturing practices, you know, nurturing environmental practices that don't make us feel like we're about to become an extinct species, and ones that we don't feel inevitably destroy, you know, the biophilia that we appear to have, and being able to look at look through different eyes at something and open up new imaginary spaces, I think just gives us many more options to make informed decisions with, however that information gets to us and however we select that. So, I mean, I for one celebrate as many tools as possible, as many paradigms as possible to start to observe something with. I think where it becomes dangerous is when we become blind to those, when it becomes a hegemony, when it becomes something that becomes a sacred cow and we can no longer critique it because either we don't know what it means anymore, like sustainability, or you know, or smart city. You know, I think that's when we kind of need to you know, be trying to push into new territories and confusing ourselves and asking ourselves difficult questions.
Is there a closing question, maybe from the audience? Don't be shy. We're nice people, actually, and we do have respect for each other. It's okay once in a while to disagree.
Did we disagree?
No, but you're in front of me, so it looks like I'm looking at you, but I'm actually looking at the audience.
Behind you. Yeah.
Okay, we could talk over dinner and after a lot of drinks, and that's one of the problems. Greeks fight other Greeks. This is miscommunication.
Yeah.
My apology. Okay, is there any other questions? No, seriously. I'm looking up and over. Nothing?
Actually, sure. I'll just ask. It seems like. Is this working? It seems like some of the technologies we've been talking about are, let's say, 3 decades away, if it's 2 decades behind aerospace, something like that. And maybe there's room for play and creativity while we're moving from a tectonic paradigm to a plastic paradigm. It seems like there's a possibility for resistance there that maybe opens up ethical or aesthetic possibilities before that transition's been completed. So I'm curious what you guys think of that.
Yes, well, if I may say something. Yes, I do agree with what you said, and I think we should not forget the issue of dependencies. Everything new creates all sorts of dependencies. A lot of our discussion about computational representation is possible because of the technology we call a computer. Without it, we don't even use this vocabulary. In cognitive science, people think of the mind as a computer because of the computer. So with the internet, you have a new metaphor, all sorts of new ideas. I mean, in a way, technology comes first, provides metaphors, opportunities for creative thinking, but also dependencies. So if every single architect is working by means of digital coding and computational algorithms, inevitably you depend on that. You naturalize something which is just a historical contingency. I mean, it just happened that we developed this kind of model. It just happened that now that you have 3D fabrication. It's not a necessity. It's just one moment in human history. So before you commit to those dependencies, before you become part of the logic of computation or 3D fabrication, I think, yes, we need to think about alternative possibilities and resistances in terms of what is the best way forward for the creative projects, for the process of creativity, in a way.
I mean, periods of big upheavals or transitions in technology are always very fertile, and I think this is the right moment to be playful with it. right? Playful in a good way, in the homo ludens kind of.
I don't think there's necessarily this sort of distinct disciplines as well when we start to think about this. I don't think that we will be waiting for aerospace to get it right and then we import it over. I think that actually, this is whole convergence, and in fact today, even I think we're still talking in terms of these sort of discrete fields. Sort of design, sort of standing up, against the sort of computation. Whereas actually, I think that going forwards, it is about this convergence, and it is about potentially, this new area which sort of comes into being, and I think that's really important.
I agree. It's a new form of serious play, because I think things have matured quite a lot, and I think obviously the presentations today are a testimony to that. But also, I think the imperative to ask questions, I think, is also really important. So how to ask more informed questions, I think, is part of one of the reasons why people come out from New York, from Boston, from everywhere, actually to have this conversation with people here, right? It's still in an educational context, and that's very important, and actually important probably in ways that we don't always fully appreciate or recognize. It's not easy to have a conversation about these subjects, and maybe my only point about the convergence would be that it seems that architects have already and has always had a very open process where they can incorporate other people. And because of that, I think they've benefited in a way to resist a form of specialization that other fields don't have. So,
I would argue that, sorry.
no, I mean, my point is that there are people in those fields that obviously are the people that are participating in these conversations because they see their project much bigger than the departments that they're in. And I think that's affording a very different kind of learning curve of really where complexity, because I go back to that word, really is residing. And part of it is communication, and it could be language in terms of the way that we communicate with each other. But for sure, models of interaction about how we really open this up as a framework to really understand is really at the height of it.
I would argue that I think that architecture is engaged a lot of the time, but I think that throughout history, it's taken more than it's given back.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you that my feeling is that architects are coming back.
Yeah, and that's my point.
The really interesting architects actually left the practice of material building in the 60s and 70s. They moved into models of communication. They realized sometimes that architecture wasn't the answer. But I'm talking about more architectural thinking is much more receptive, I think, to some of these conversations today. And I think that's where speculation is, because I do think some of these problems are for sure spatial.
I agree, and from someone who's been talking a lot about this in other disciplines, I think that there is actual space there and a need for design to come back into the frame. Sure. In a really sort of big way. So.
Okay, so maybe with that, just a thank you to Kostas for organizing this event at the AA, and for all of you for coming.